The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty road. Jack, a ruthless biker with a reputation for trouble, revved the engine of his Harley, feeling the vibrations shoot up his spine. He wore a leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days, its edges frayed from years of use, and his face was a mask of hardened indifference. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the road ahead, looking for something, anything, to break the monotony of the endless highway. His life had become a cycle of aimless drifting, fueled by alcohol, anger, and a deep sense of abandonment. Once a rising star in the world of motorcycle racing, Jack's life had shattered in an instant, an accident that left him physically scarred and mentally broken. He'd lost everything: his career, his friends, even his family. Now, the only thing that seemed to keep him going was the thrill of causing chaos. The road stretched on, empty and silent, until Jack spotted something moving in the distance. It was small, too small to be anything significant, but it caught his attention. He slowed down, his curiosity piqued. As he drew closer, he saw it clearly: a dog, trotting along the side of the road, its tail wagging in the breeze. The dog was a scruffy little thing, its fur a mix of brown and white, its eyes wide with innocence. It didn't seem to have a care in the world, and for a split second, Jack almost felt a flicker of something inside him, a long-buried sense of tenderness. But then, that feeling was quickly replaced by irritation. Why should this dog get to wander so carelessly while he was stuck in this hell of his own making? With a smirk on his face, Jack leaned over the handlebars of his bike, his boots scraping the ground as he approached the dog. It was too close now, its joyful, oblivious demeanor almost mocking him. His eyes hardened as he revved the engine once again, then leaned down and, without thinking, kicked the dog hard in its side. The small dog yelped in pain, staggering back in shock. It didn't understand why it was being hurt. It only wanted to greet the stranger, maybe wag its tail or sniff his boots. Instead, it was sent flying back into the dirt. Jack laughed, his voice rough and low, echoing in the empty air. He didn't care. The dog was just another thing to kick around, another thing to prove how little the world really mattered. But what Jack didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this wasn't just any dog. Buddy, as the dog was called, belonged to someone who had the means and power to make Jack regret every single decision he'd ever made. Cut to a passing car. A middle-aged man and his wife were driving home from dinner when they saw the incident unfold. The man, shocked by what he witnessed, quickly grabbed his phone and recorded a short video of the biker kicking the defenseless animal. "Did you see that? That guy just kicked that dog," the man said, his voice trembling with anger. His wife was already on the phone, dialing animal control, but the man had other ideas. He uploaded the video to social media with a single sentence attached: "No one should get away with this." It didn't take long for the video to go viral. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jack had never been the type to follow the rules. Growing up in the back alleys of a small town, he quickly learned that survival was about toughness, and toughness didn't come from playing nice. His father, a hard-drinking mechanic who spent more time at the bar than at home, had taught him that the world wasn't kind, and you didn't get anywhere by being kind. His mother? She left when Jack was only 5, disappearing into the night without so much as a goodbye. Jack had always wondered if she'd left because of him. His earliest memories were filled with her absence. His adolescence was marked by rebellious stunts and constant run-ins with the law. But the one thing that kept him sane through the chaos was his love for motorcycles. By the time he was 16, Jack had already learned how to ride, fix, and race bikes with an intensity that could have rivaled the pros. The bike was the one thing that made him feel free, like he could escape the shackles of his broken family life. On the open road, it was just him, the engine, and the wind. But everything changed after that night, the night that ruined everything. It was a race, like so many others before it. The adrenaline, the speed, the feeling of being invincible. Jack was in the lead, just a few miles from the finish line when disaster struck. One of the other riders lost control and veered into Jack's lane. The collision was inevitable. Jack's body was mangled, broken in ways doctors weren't sure would ever heal. He spent months in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, each day a reminder of the fragility of life. When he finally left the hospital, his life was unrecognizable. He wasn't the hotshot racer anymore. He was just a scarred, angry man with nowhere to go. His friends, if you could even call them that, disappeared. The racing world had no place for someone like him now. His family? They were a distant memory. His father, even more of a wreck after years of self-destruction, had only offered Jack cold sympathy. His mother had long since faded from his thoughts, just another casualty of his past. Jack found himself alone in a world that didn't seem to care. So, he embraced it. He embraced the anger, the bitterness, the loneliness. The one thing he could rely on now was his bike, but even that couldn't bring him peace. No matter how fast he rode, no matter how loud the engine roared, there was always something gnawing at him, something he couldn't outrun. And then came the violence. At first, it was small, getting into fights at bars, picking on people who looked like easy targets. But the thrill of hurting others began to satisfy a dark part of him, a part that had grown in the shadows of his childhood. Soon, it wasn't enough to just fight. He needed to break things, destroy them, just like his own life had been broken. Jack started finding his amusement in cruelty. It wasn't just the people on the other end of his fists. It was anything weaker than him. A stray dog? Kick it. A car blocking his path? Scratch it with his bike. The more he did, the more numb he became. It was the only way to feel something, anything. But even in his darkest moments, Jack couldn't completely escape the whispers of regret that followed him. Sometimes, late at night, after a long ride through the empty streets, he'd feel something stirring inside him. A small, distant voice that asked, "What happened to you, Jack? What did you become?" But he'd drown it out. It was easier to stay angry, easier to keep moving forward with his head down, to let the world around him burn while he just kept riding. He pulled up to a bar on the edge of town, the same one he frequented most nights. The neon sign flickered, casting a dim glow over the cracked pavement. He stepped off his bike, the sound of his boots thudding against the concrete, and pushed through the door. Inside, the usual crowd of tired, broken people were hunched over their beers, staring into nothing. Jack didn't care for the company. He was just there to numb the pain for a few hours. But as he sat at the bar, the bartender, a grizzled older man who had seen enough of Jack's outbursts to know better, raised an eyebrow. "Jack," the bartender said, setting a drink in front of him, "you're gonna get yourself in real trouble one of these days." Jack grunted, taking the drink without a word. He'd heard it before. The concerned voices, the half-hearted warnings. It didn't matter. He'd never let anyone get too close. It was easier that way. Jack took a long gulp of his drink, staring into the glass as the crowd around him faded into a blurry hum. The bitterness of the alcohol did little to wash away the bitterness that had settled in his soul, but it dulled it, just enough to get through the night. His mind wandered back to that moment on the road earlier, kicking that dog. It was just a stupid dog, right? A small thing that had crossed his path. Why should he care? But even as he tried to justify it, a part of him felt something gnawing at him, something uncomfortable. He pushed it away. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, I'll find something else to do. Maybe a race, maybe a fight. Something to remind myself that I'm still here. The video was everywhere. It took less than an hour for the clip to spread across the internet. It wasn't just some random person's feed anymore. It was trending. Thousands of angry comments flooded social media, with hashtags like #JusticeForBuddy and #StopAnimalCruelty making their rounds. People were outraged, demanding that the man in the video be held accountable for hurting a defenseless animal. But the worst part? Jack didn't even know what was happening. He was still sitting in the bar when his phone started buzzing incessantly in his pocket. He barely paid attention to it, as he was lost in his drink, nursing his usual loneliness. But when it buzzed again, this time with a name he recognized, a name from the past, he pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. It was a message from one of his old buddies, Pete. "Dude, what the hell did you do? This video's everywhere." Confused, Jack opened the message and clicked the link. The screen was filled with a blurry video of a biker in a leather jacket, kicking a small dog on the side of the road. The dog yelped in pain, stumbling back into the dirt. The video wasn't much longer than a few seconds, but it was enough. Jack froze as he watched himself, his face unmistakable. That was him, the same jacket, the same bike. "Damn it," Jack muttered, slamming the phone down onto the counter. His heart raced, his fingers tingled with a mix of anger and fear. He hadn't realized anyone had seen. He hadn't realized the video would spread so quickly, and he definitely hadn't realized that people would care so much. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was just another piece of noise in a world that loved drama. But the more he thought about it, the more that gnawing feeling in his chest, the one he usually drowned in alcohol and violence, grew. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt exposed. It wasn't just his friends who saw it. By the time Jack returned to his apartment late that night, the video had been shared by thousands, viewed by millions. His phone was flooded with messages. Some were from strangers, angry and demanding an explanation. Others were from old friends, asking him what the hell was going on. But the one message that stood out the most was from an account with a name he'd never expected to see. Elon Musk. He didn't know how it happened, but somehow, in the blur of social media activity, Elon Musk himself had taken notice of the video. The message was short, blunt, and chilling. "You've made a mistake, Jack. I want to speak with you. You'll regret hurting Buddy." Jack stared at the message, blinking several times as his mind tried to process it. Elon Musk? The name didn't make sense at first. Sure, Jack had heard of him. Everyone had. The tech mogul, the guy behind Tesla and SpaceX, one of the richest men on the planet. But what did he want with Jack? At first, Jack thought it was some kind of joke. Maybe someone was trolling him, using a fake account to mess with him. But when he clicked on Elon's profile, everything seemed legitimate. The blue checkmark, the followers, and the comment sections under his posts were full of people calling for Jack to face consequences for what he'd done to Buddy. This wasn't a joke. Jack wasn't stupid. He knew what kind of person Elon Musk was. He wasn't someone who just sat back when something mattered to him. Elon Musk wasn't some rich, out-of-touch celebrity who only cared about his bottom line. He was a man of action. And Buddy, the dog Jack had kicked without thinking, wasn't just any dog. According to the social media posts and comments flooding in, Buddy was beloved, even famous in his own right. Buddy belonged to Elon Musk. The realization hit Jack like a freight train. Jack had done something no one could overlook. And now, there were consequences coming, bigger than any fight he'd ever been in. It wasn't just about some random biker kicking a dog anymore. It was about messing with the wrong person. Jack suddenly realized that this was bigger than him, much bigger. The storm was coming, and there was nowhere to hide. Back in his apartment, Jack couldn't stop scrolling through the posts. People were furious. Animal rights groups were calling for Jack to be charged with animal cruelty, and some had even posted his home address. A few angry comments threatened physical harm. Others promised to make his life a living hell. But Jack, despite the danger, couldn't look away. There was one post that caught his attention, a tweet from Elon Musk himself. "I don't take cruelty lightly. Jack, if you're reading this, I want to see you face to face. This is not just about Buddy. It's about understanding why what you did matters. We will meet." The tweet went viral, shared by millions of people who now eagerly anticipated Jack's next move. The eyes of the world were on him. The anger was growing. And Jack, for the first time in his life, was scared. But then again, fear had always been a part of Jack's life. It was the reason he'd become the monster he was. Fear had driven him to hurt others, to numb himself to the world. Fear was a part of his DNA. But this was different. This was a man who had the power, the influence, and the will to change Jack's life forever. Jack leaned back against his couch, closing his eyes. His mind raced. His reputation, his life, everything was unraveling. One stupid mistake, and now the weight of the world was on his shoulders. "Damn it," he muttered again. But this time, there was something else in his voice. Something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of guilt. The next morning, Jack woke to a flood of notifications. His phone buzzed incessantly beside him, as if the world had decided to keep him awake with its endless rage. His hands shook as he picked it up, the cold screen reflecting back his disheveled face in the dim light of his apartment. The first thing he saw was another message from Elon Musk. This one wasn't as simple as the last. "I have someone who wants to speak with you. Be ready." Jack's stomach twisted. This wasn't a conversation. This was something else. Who could Elon Musk be sending to talk to him? Jack had no clue, but deep down, he feared what might be coming. He didn't know if this was a warning or an ultimatum. Either way, it wasn't something he could run from. Trying to shake off the dread crawling up his spine, Jack grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen, unscrewed the cap, and took a long swig. He leaned back against the couch, breathing slowly as the alcohol burned down his throat. For a moment, the world felt a little less heavy. But only for a moment. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a message, it was a call. He squinted at the screen. The number was unlisted. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to answer. But the fear gnawing at him was stronger than the desire to ignore it. He pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. "Yeah." Jack's voice was rough, too tired, too angry. There was a pause on the other end, and then a calm, almost serene voice responded, "Jack, this is Dr. William Harris. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Musk." The name hit Jack like a punch to the gut. Dr. William Harris, one of the top behavioral psychologists in the world. Jack had read about him. Everyone had. He was the kind of man who had solved some of the toughest criminal cases in history. He had a reputation for getting inside people's heads, making them see the world differently. And now, he was calling for Jack. Jack didn't know whether to laugh or to hang up. "What the hell does he want with me?" Jack growled, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Harris's tone remained smooth, patient. "Mr. Musk believes that you have the potential to change. He has a proposition for you." Jack snorted. "Change? Me? You've got the wrong guy." Dr. Harris didn't flinch. "You're right. You're not the same man you were 10 years ago, Jack. But people can change. If you're willing to confront your past and your mistakes." Jack felt his heart skip a beat. There was something in the psychologist's voice, something that hinted at a deeper truth. Change. That word had always made Jack uneasy. Change meant vulnerability. It meant opening himself up to something beyond the rage and numbness he'd been living with for so long. "What are you talking about?" Jack spat. "I don't need your damn help. I don't need to change." Dr. Harris sighed, but there was no judgment in his voice, just calm understanding. "You might think you don't need help, Jack, but the truth is, you're stuck in a loop of your own making. What you did to Buddy, it's not just about the dog. It's about everything that's led you here. The anger, the violence, the way you treat yourself and the world around you. Mr. Musk is offering you a chance to face that, if you're willing to take it." Jack clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger rise in his chest. He wanted to yell, to tell the guy to shut up. But something in Dr. Harris's words resonated with him. He had been angry for as long as he could remember. Angry at his father, angry at his mother, angry at life. Maybe he had been angry at himself, too, but he couldn't face that yet. Still, he wasn't about to let a stranger tell him what to do. "Look," Jack said, trying to regain some control, "I don't care about your damn psychology lessons. I don't owe anyone an apology, especially not to some rich guy who thinks he can buy justice." Dr. Harris didn't argue. Instead, his voice grew even more measured. "The thing is, Jack, Mr. Musk isn't just any rich guy. He's someone who knows what it means to fail, to lose everything, and to rebuild. He's offering you a chance to understand what true redemption looks like. But it will require you to face the very things you've been running from." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. Was he really hearing this? This wasn't some motivational speech. This was something deeper, something more personal. He didn't want to confront his past. He didn't want to face the guilt, the shame, the things he'd buried so deep. But here was someone powerful, asking him to do just that. "You're not going to stop, are you?" Jack said bitterly. "You'll just keep pushing until I give in." "No," Dr. Harris replied, his voice unwavering. "I'm not here to push you. I'm here to help you see what you're missing, what you're running from." There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment, before Dr. Harris spoke again. Mr. Musk has arranged a meeting for you. It's your choice whether or not to attend. But you need to understand, this is your opportunity to take responsibility for what you did and to make things right. Jack felt his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. He was used to running from problems, used to escaping responsibility. But this was different. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't a barroom brawl or a reckless ride down an empty highway. This was a chance to face the one thing he feared most, the man he had become. Before Jack could respond, Dr. Harris spoke again, his tone more gentle now. You're not alone in this, Jack. Everyone has a chance for redemption, but you have to be ready to accept it. With that, the line went dead. Jack sat there in silence, the weight of Dr. Harris's words sinking in. His apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in on him. He stared at the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. But one thing was clear. His life was about to change, whether he was ready for it or not. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and messages. Jack had never felt more scrutinized in his life. The media frenzy surrounding the video of him kicking Buddy had only intensified, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the weight of public opinion was crushing. But despite the chaos, one thing stood out: the meeting. Elon Musk had offered Jack a chance to make things right. And now, Jack had no choice but to show up. He arrived at the private airstrip outside the city early in the morning. The cold air bit at his skin, the sun just starting to rise on the horizon. A sleek, black Tesla Model X was parked by the hangar, and standing next to it was a figure Jack recognized instantly: Dr. William Harris, the calm, calculating psychologist who had been in charge of the message exchange. And next to him, far more imposing than Jack had imagined, was the man himself, Elon Musk. Musk wasn't what Jack had expected. He had imagined someone cold, distant, maybe even intimidating. But Musk was normal. He was wearing a simple gray sweatshirt, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing like the larger-than-life persona that Jack had seen in the media. Yet there was something undeniable about him. An aura of power and presence that made him seem like he could bend the world to his will if he chose. Elon looked up as Jack approached, his expression unreadable. "Jack," he said simply, extending his hand. Jack hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. It was firm, businesslike, but there was no hostility in it. No anger. Just calm. "Mr. Musk," Jack said, his voice raspy, unsure of what to say. "You can call me Elon," Musk replied with a faint smile. "I think we need to talk." They walked toward the hangar, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet filling the silence. Dr. Harris followed behind them, his expression neutral but attentive. The three men entered a private jet that was already prepped for takeoff, the sleek interior far beyond what Jack was used to. The seats were luxurious, almost too much so. It felt like being in another world. A world Jack wasn't sure he belonged in. Elon sat across from Jack, and after a brief moment of silence, he spoke again, his tone surprisingly soft. "You must be wondering why I'm doing this." Jack didn't know how to answer. He didn't know if he was supposed to feel grateful, angry, or confused. "Honestly, yeah. I thought I'd be facing a lawsuit, not flying in a private jet with the guy who owns half of Silicon Valley." Elon chuckled lightly, the sound surprisingly genuine. "You've earned the attention, Jack. But I don't think this is about punishment. I think it's about understanding. Understanding your actions and, more importantly, understanding yourself." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't sure he wanted to understand himself. He had spent years running from the man he had become, and facing it seemed impossible. "I don't know what you want me to say," Jack muttered. "I screwed up. I kicked a dog. I didn't think about it. I didn't care about it." Elon didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes intense. "That's the problem, Jack. You didn't think. But it's more than just kicking a dog. It's about what that action represents." Dr. Harris, who had been quietly observing, now spoke up. "Jack, what you did wasn't just an isolated incident. It's a pattern. You've built your life around anger, at your father, at the world, at yourself. And that anger makes you numb to the things that really matter. It's not just about the dog. It's about what the dog represents to you. and what you've been avoiding for years. Jack's jaw clenched. He didn't like where this conversation was going. It was like Dr. Harris was peeling away layers he wasn't ready to expose. But the more he listened, the more he couldn't deny it. There was truth in what they were saying. I'm not some victim, all right? Jack said defensively. My life hasn't been easy, and I've had to fight for everything. I'm not asking for sympathy. Elon nodded. I'm not offering sympathy, Jack. I'm offering a chance. A chance to stop fighting everything, to stop running from the anger and start dealing with it. Jack looked at Elon, bewildered. A chance? To do what? What do you expect from me? Elon's gaze softened slightly. I don't expect anything from you, Jack. But Buddy expects something from you. He's part of the reason we're here. I think you owe it to yourself and to him to face what you've been avoiding. For the first time in the conversation, Jack was silent. He thought about the dog. Buddy, the small, defenseless animal he had kicked for no reason other than his own frustration. He had dismissed it as nothing, just a passing moment. But now, with Elon and Dr. Harris sitting in front of him, he realized it was more than just a dog. It was a reflection of everything he had become. The flight took a few hours, and Jack spent most of it in a daze. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation, this kind of introspection. It felt like everything he had ever believed about himself was being questioned. He was used to being the tough guy, the biker who didn't care about anything. But sitting in this jet, talking to Elon Musk and Dr. Harris, it felt like his world was shattering. They landed at a private estate in a secluded part of California. The mansion was massive, a sprawling compound nestled between rolling hills. Jack followed Elon and Dr. Harris out of the jet and into the main house. It was quiet, peaceful, nothing like the life Jack was used to. Everything here felt pristine, almost too perfect. Inside, they sat down at a large dining table. Elon offered Jack a glass of water, his gaze never leaving him. I've seen a lot of people in my life, Jack, Elon said. People who think they're beyond redemption, who think they've done too much to change. But I'm here to tell you that no one is beyond redemption. Not you, not Buddy, and not anyone else. Jack felt the weight of Elon's words settle on his shoulders. This wasn't about a dog anymore. This was about him, about facing his mistakes and the man he had become. The estate felt like a different world, a world Jack didn't belong to. He sat at the long, gleaming table, the silence between him and Elon Musk thick with unspoken words. Dr. Harris had excused himself, leaving them alone. The only sound was the distant hum of the estate's quiet luxury, a far cry from the noisy bars and empty streets Jack was used to. Jack didn't know what to expect from this meeting. Hell, he hadn't expected to even get this far. He thought he'd be facing a lawsuit, maybe a fine at best. But instead, he was here, in front of one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the world, being offered something he never thought he needed. A chance to change. Elon didn't speak right away, allowing the silence to stretch longer than Jack was comfortable with. The cool, glassy exterior of the mansion seemed to reflect his own inner turmoil. He'd been running from his past for years, his upbringing, his mistakes, his anger. But now, it was like someone had thrown a spotlight on everything he had tried to hide. I'm not a charity case, Elon, Jack said finally, his voice gruff. I don't need you to fix me. Elon smiled faintly. You're right. This isn't about fixing you. It's about understanding yourself. And it's not just about what happened with Buddy. It's about why you did it. What you were running from. Jack rubbed his temples. He'd heard this before. I'm not some textbook case. I didn't do it because of some deep psychological issue. I did it because I was pissed off. I'd had a bad day, I was drunk, and the dog just got in the way. Simple as that. But Elon didn't look convinced. You're telling yourself a story, Jack. But the truth is deeper than that. People do things like that because they've never dealt with their own pain. You've built your entire life around running from your anger. You don't see the connection between the way you treat the world and the way you treat yourself. Jack's gut tightened. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to think about the things he buried deep inside. But there was a part of him, a part that he tried to silence for so long, that knew Elon was right. His whole life had been a series of distractions. Riding his bike, drinking away his frustrations, pushing people away. "That's easy for you to say," Jack muttered. "You're some rich, successful guy with a perfect life. What do you know about being stuck, about being trapped in your own head?" Elon leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "I know more than you think, Jack. I wasn't born into this life. I came from nothing. My family didn't have money. My father was hard on me, just like you had a tough relationship with your father. The difference is, I chose to deal with my anger. I chose to face it, rather than let it control me." Jack froze. He wasn't sure if it was the way Elon said it, or if it was just the weight of the words themselves, but it hit him hard. Anger. That was the root of it all. The thing that drove him, that consumed him. He had always thought of himself as someone who could push through, who didn't need help, but now, the truth was undeniable. Anger had been his shield, his weapon, but it was also what had kept him from being the man he wanted to be. Elon continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "It doesn't matter how successful you are. If you're still running from your pain, you're never free. And that's why we're here, Jack. I'm offering you a way out. A way to face the things that haunt you. But you have to be ready to face them." Jack sat back in his chair, staring at Elon for a long moment. He could feel his chest tighten, the familiar knot of frustration rising. But something about Elon's calm presence, the way he spoke with no judgment, made Jack wonder. Could I actually change? Could I actually face everything I've been running from? Before Jack could respond, Elon stood up and walked over to a window that overlooked the sprawling estate. The early morning sun was filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Elon glanced back over his shoulder. "Change isn't easy, Jack. It takes time. It takes confronting the darkest parts of yourself. But it's worth it. Not just for you, but for everyone you've hurt along the way." His eyes locked with Jack's. "I'm not asking you to do it alone. That's why I've brought you here. I want to help you find your way out of this." Jack felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and even a hint of fear. But under all of that was something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Jack muttered, his voice low. "I've spent my whole life running. I don't know what I'll be without the anger." Elon turned back to face him. "That's why we're here, Jack. To help you find out." The next few days passed in a blur of activities designed to break down the walls Jack had spent years building. Elon and Dr. Harris had arranged for him to meet with a team of therapists, counselors, and former convicts who had been through similar struggles. They didn't just talk about anger management or therapy. They took Jack through the motions, forcing him to confront the deep-rooted emotions he had spent years trying to numb. The first few sessions were brutal. Jack was resistant at first, shutting down, pushing away every attempt to make him look inward. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't want to face the things he had done, the choices he had made. But every time he tried to walk away, Dr. Harris or one of the counselors was there, gently guiding him back. And then, one night, something shifted. Jack was alone in the estate's gym, pounding away at the heavy bag, his fists flying with the same reckless fury he had used to drown out his emotions. Sweat poured down his face, and the anger in his chest felt like it might finally explode. He didn't even realize that Elon had entered the room until he heard his voice. "Jack," Elon said softly, "you can't punch your way out of this." Jack paused mid-punch, his fists still clenched. He turned to face Elon, his breath heavy and labored. "You don't get it, do you? This is all I know." Elon took a step closer, his gaze steady. "I know, but this isn't going to fix you. Anger only leads to more anger. You have to deal with what's beneath it." Jack stared at him, his chest rising and falling. For a moment, he just stood there, caught between the desire to keep fighting and the truth that was beginning to break through. Finally, he dropped his fists to his sides and took a deep breath. "Okay," Jack said quietly. "Okay, I'll try." The following weeks were the hardest of Jack's life. At first, the process felt like a slow suffocation. Like every session, every conversation, every moment of introspection was chipping away at the person he thought he was. But somewhere between the grueling therapy sessions, the countless talks with Dr. Harris, and the constant support from Elon and the team, something in him began to shift. He was still angry. Hell, that would never go away completely, but now he had the tools to deal with it. Slowly, Jack started to see the patterns in his life. The moments where he lashed out in rage, the times he pushed people away, the fear he carried inside him. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about everything he had buried for years. The resentment, the disappointment, the feeling of being alone. And now, for the first time, he was facing it all. One afternoon, Jack found himself alone in the estate's garden. A quiet space that felt more like a sanctuary than anything else. The estate had become a place of unexpected calm, a place where he could sit without the pressure of the outside world and just think. The garden was meticulously cared for, with blooming flowers and small fountains scattered throughout. For someone like Jack, who had spent most of his life on the road, it was almost too peaceful. He sat on a bench, his mind replaying everything. The fight with his father, the empty relationships, the anger that seemed to guide him more than anything else. Is this really me? He wondered. Is this all I've got? A voice broke through his thoughts. You know, you're not as bad as you think. Jack looked up to see Elon standing nearby, his hands in his pockets, as relaxed as always. I didn't think you'd be the kind of guy to hang out in a garden, Jack replied, his voice a little hoarse. Elon chuckled. You'd be surprised. Sometimes the quiet is the loudest thing. Jack raised an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be some kind of life lesson? No, Elon said, walking toward him and sitting down on the bench beside him. It's just the truth. You've spent so much of your life running from your anger, from your pain, that you've never stopped to listen to yourself, to really hear what's going on inside. Jack shifted uneasily. I don't know what you mean. I'm hearing everything right now, and it sucks. Elon smiled softly. Yeah, it's supposed to suck. That's how you know you're making progress. It's only when you're uncomfortable that you start growing. Jack looked away, his jaw tightening. I don't think I can change Elon. I don't think I can undo everything I've done. Elon was quiet for a moment. You don't have to undo everything. You just have to take responsibility, step by step, and stop running from the things you can't control. Jack sighed, leaning back against the bench, staring up at the sky. The clouds were thick and gray, a storm threatening to break, but for once, he didn't feel the overwhelming need to run from it. He had spent so much of his life trying to outrun the storm that now, sitting in the garden with Elon, he felt like maybe, just maybe, it was time to face it. Later that evening, Jack attended another therapy session, but this time, it was different. Dr. Harris had arranged for him to meet with a few of the other people staying at the estate, people who had gone through their own struggles and were now finding a way to rebuild their lives. It was supposed to be a group session, but to Jack, it felt like more than that. It felt like an opportunity. As he walked into the room, he could already feel the nervous energy in the air. There were about a dozen people, all sitting in a circle, most of them looking uncertain, some with their arms crossed, others nervously tapping their feet. Jack took a seat on an empty chair, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to open up. He wasn't that guy. But deep down, he knew this was what he needed. Dr. Harris started the session by asking everyone to introduce themselves. It was a simple enough request, but for Jack, it felt like a challenge. His name was all he had left, a name he'd worn like armor for years. But now, in this circle of strangers, it felt like the only thing holding him back. When it was his turn, Jack cleared his throat. I'm Jack, he said, his voice rough. I'm here to fix my life, I guess. I don't really know where to start. The circle fell silent. Jack glanced around, unsure of what he expected. He wasn't looking for pity, but he was hoping for something. A sign, a connection. One of the women, a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair and a warm smile, spoke up first. You're not alone in this, Jack. We all have our own battles. Some of us are here because of addiction, some because of lost relationships, but we're all trying to heal. And you're here for a reason. Another man, a tall guy with a scruffy beard and kind eyes, added, None of us came here because we thought we had it all figured out. We came here because we wanted to change. And we're all working on it, one day at a time. Jack swallowed hard, the weight of their words sinking in. These people weren't judging him. They weren't looking for him to be perfect. They just wanted him to be real. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, he could let his guard down. As the session continued, Jack listened more than he spoke. He was starting to see that his problems weren't as unique as he thought. Everyone had their own struggles, their own stories, and they were all trying to make sense of them. The anger, the shame, the regret, they weren't just his to carry. They were universal. By the time the session ended, Jack felt a shift inside him. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. He wasn't ready to forgive himself, not yet. But for the first time, he didn't feel completely lost. That night, as he lay in his bed, Jack's thoughts weren't consumed by the guilt of his past actions. They weren't filled with self-loathing or the urge to run away. Instead, they were filled with something else, something new. Hope. He wasn't sure what the future held. He didn't know if he could ever fully make up for what he'd done. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to keep running. He was going to face whatever came next, and for the first time in his life, he was willing to walk through it with his head held high. The following morning, the tension was thick in the air. Jack had woken up earlier than usual, his thoughts swirling in every direction. He had always believed that the past was something you could bury, something you could outrun. But now, after weeks of therapy and reflection, Jack was starting to realize that no matter how fast he ran, his past had a way of catching up with him. And now, it was time to face it. After breakfast, Elon approached Jack with a quiet, measured tone. "Today's a big day, Jack," he said, his eyes scanning Jack's face for any hint of resistance. "Are you ready?" Jack met his gaze. "Ready for what?" Elon's expression didn't change. "You've been working on yourself for weeks now, but there's one thing you haven't done. You haven't faced the people you've hurt. Your father, your ex, the people you've abandoned or betrayed. It's time to make amends, Jack." Jack's stomach tightened at the thought. He had kept his distance from everyone for years, knowing that reconnecting would only open old wounds. His father, a man who had never understood him. His ex-girlfriend, Sarah, who had walked away when things got too complicated. And countless others who had been collateral damage in the wake of his rage. What could he possibly say to make it right? "You want me to just show up and apologize?" Jack scoffed. "That's not going to fix anything." Elon was silent for a moment before responding, his voice calm but firm. "No, Jack. Apologies don't fix everything, but they're the first step. Facing the people you've hurt, admitting your mistakes. It's the only way you can move forward. It's about accountability." Jack didn't reply immediately. His mind raced, thinking of all the people he had pushed away over the years. Could he really face them? The idea of confronting the people he'd betrayed seemed impossible. Yet, deep down, he knew that if he was ever going to move on, he had to take that step. By the time Jack arrived at the local coffee shop, his palms were sweating, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been years since he last saw Sarah. She had moved on, found someone else, built a life without him. And he had no idea what to expect now, walking into her world after everything he had done. The bell above the door jingled as Jack stepped inside, the familiar scent of roasted coffee beans filling the air. The place hadn't changed much. Sarah's favorite table by the window was still empty. For a moment, Jack almost turned around and walked out. He wasn't sure if he could go through with it. But then, he saw her. She was sitting at the table, a book in front of her, completely unaware of his presence. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Sarah looked older, more mature, but she still had that same soft smile that had always made Jack feel like he belonged. The sight of her stirred 1,000 emotions inside him: regret, shame, longing, but most of all, the undeniable truth that he had lost her. Taking a deep breath, Jack walked over to the table, his footsteps echoing louder than he would have liked. Sarah looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to caution. "Jack," she said, her voice hesitant but not unkind. "What are you doing here?" Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wasn't sure how to begin. I know this is out of the blue. I needed to see you. I owe you an apology, Sarah. I messed up. I hurt you, and I have no excuses for it." Sarah studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "You hurt me?" She paused, and Jack could see the walls she had built around herself. "You think an apology is going to fix that?" He shook his head, his eyes dropping to the floor. "No, I don't think it will fix anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For not being there when you needed me. For pushing you away, for being angry all the time. I was a mess, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know." There was a long silence as Sarah looked at him, the weight of the past pressing down on both of them. Jack felt the sting of his own words. He had hurt her more than he had ever allowed himself to admit. But now, there was no turning back. This was his moment to finally face what he had done. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah let out a long breath. "You were always running, Jack. I couldn't keep up with that. I couldn't love someone who didn't know how to love themselves." Jack nodded, the pain of her words settling deep within him. He had heard it before, but hearing it again made it more real. I know I wasn't the person you needed, and I'm sorry for that." Sarah met his gaze, and for a brief moment, Jack saw a flicker of something. Sadness, maybe, or forgiveness. But whatever it was fleeting. "I'm glad you're trying to make things right, Jack, but I'm not the same person I was when we were together. I've moved on, and I think it's time you do too." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "I get it. I'm not asking for anything, Sarah. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." She gave him a small smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Take care of yourself, Jack. I hope you find what you're looking for." As Jack turned to leave, he felt the weight of the conversation sink in. He hadn't expected Sarah to welcome him back with open arms, but hearing her words stung nonetheless. It was a reminder that some things, no matter how hard you try, can never be undone. But Jack was learning, sometimes, all you can do is take responsibility and keep moving forward. That evening, after the conversation with Sarah, Jack sat alone on the porch of the estate, staring out at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything. There was a certain beauty in the stillness, a quiet that mirrored his thoughts. He had faced Sarah. He had apologized for the past. And even though it hadn't gone the way he had hoped, it was a step. He could feel it. Each step forward, no matter how small, was breaking the cycle of anger and regret that had held him hostage for so long. The sound of footsteps behind him made Jack turn around. Elon had come out to join him, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "How did it go?" Elon asked gently, taking a seat next to him. Jack shrugged, his voice rough. "It was harder than I thought. I don't think she'll ever forgive me, but at least I told her the truth." Elon nodded slowly. "You can't control how people respond, Jack, but you can control how you move forward. Facing the past isn't about fixing everything, it's about acknowledging it. And you've done that. You're not the same person you were when you walked in here." Jack let out a long breath, staring at the sunset. "I still don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm actually trying." Elon gave him a small smile. "That's the only thing that matters." The days after Jack's conversation with Sarah were quieter than usual. He found himself reflecting more than he had in years, each moment bringing a new realization or a raw emotion he had long buried. The pain of seeing Sarah move on, of realizing how much time he had wasted running from his past, was still with him, but it was different now. There was a new sense of clarity in his mind, and with that clarity came the uncomfortable truth. He had hurt others, and he couldn't undo what had been done. But that didn't mean he couldn't try to make things right. Jack spent the next few days thinking about who else he had to confront. His father loomed in his mind like a shadow he couldn't escape. Their relationship had been fractured for as long as he could remember, defined by misunderstandings, unspoken words, and deep-seated resentment. But Jack knew that if he was ever going to rebuild himself, he had to face the man who had shaped so much of who he had become. It was late afternoon when Jack made the call. His father's number, the one he had memorized long ago but had never called, flashed on his screen. For a moment, he hesitated. The past was a heavy thing to carry, but it was also the only thing that felt familiar. He pressed dial. The phone rang several times before his father answered, his gruff voice breaking the silence. "Jack?" His father's voice sounded distant, but there was a hint of something, Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity? Yeah, it's me, Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I. I was wondering if we could talk. There was a pause on the other end, a silence that felt thick and heavy, like the weight of all the years they had spent avoiding each other. Talk? His father's voice cracked. About what? Jack swallowed, the words getting stuck in his throat. About everything. About how I've been a jerk. About the things I've done. I know it's been a long time, but I need to say some things. Another long silence. Jack could almost hear his father trying to process the words, the weight of them pressing down on both of them. All right, his father finally said. You've got 5 minutes. What do you want to say? Jack took a deep breath. I'm sorry. I've been angry for a long time, and I know that it's hurt you. I never said it, but I've always looked up to you, even though I didn't know how to show it. I've blamed you for things I should have taken responsibility for myself. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I just need you to know that I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, an unspoken weight that neither of them had ever dared to lift. Jack waited, his heart pounding, unsure of what would come next. I don't know what you expect me to say, Jack, his father replied after a long pause, his voice softening slightly. You've always been a wild one. I didn't know how to handle you, and I guess you didn't know how to handle me. But I'll tell you this, when you left, I thought I'd lost you for good. I guess I wasn't ready to face what I did wrong either. Jack's chest tightened. His father's words, though few, were heavy. There was something there, something Jack hadn't expected. Vulnerability? It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to crack the wall that had stood between them for so long. You didn't lose me, Dad, Jack said softly. I was just lost myself. And I'm sorry I didn't tell you that sooner. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jack could feel the distance between them shrinking, little by little. Finally, his father spoke again. Well, I don't know what comes next. But I appreciate you saying that, Jack. I really do. Maybe we can try to make up for some of the lost time. Jack smiled, a bittersweet expression on his face. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For the first time in years, he felt the flicker of hope that something could be repaired between them. The conversation with his father was a strange one. There were no big emotional breakthroughs, no grand declarations, but something had shifted. Jack didn't expect miracles. The road to rebuilding a relationship that had been broken for so long wasn't going to be smooth. But at least now, there was a crack in the wall, a way forward, even if it was a slow and uncertain one. Over the next few days, Jack began to rebuild more than just his relationship with his father. He started reaching out to old friends, people he had pushed away over the years. His old bandmates, people he had once called family, had long since gone their separate ways, but Jack knew that the distance between them had been self-inflicted. And now, he had to face the consequences of his actions. He called Mike first, the drummer who had been a constant presence in his life until the fallout from the band's dissolution had driven them apart. It wasn't easy. Mike was reluctant to answer at first, but Jack persisted, leaving a message that he wanted to talk. Mike finally agreed to meet him at a bar they used to hang out at, a place that was as familiar as it was filled with ghosts. When Jack walked into the bar, Mike was already there, sitting at a corner booth. The old familiar energy hung in the air, but this time, there was no music, no laughter, just a thick silence that felt harder to break than the years they'd spent apart. Mike looked up as Jack approached. I didn't think you'd actually show, he said, his voice guarded. Jack sat down across from him, leaning in slightly. I wouldn't have come if I didn't mean it. I'm not the same guy I was when I walked out. I messed up, Mike. I pushed you and the band away, and I never explained why. I was angry, I was stupid, and I didn't know how to handle things. But I need you to know that I'm sorry for what I did. For everything. Mike stared at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Jack wasn't sure what to expect, but he could feel the weight of Mike's silence. Finally, Mike sighed and shook his head. You always did have a way of burning bridges, Jack, Mike said, his voice still tinged with bitterness. But I'll give you credit. You're here now. That means something. Jack nodded. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if things can go back to the way they were. But I'm here, and I want to make things right. At least try. Mike considered this for a moment, and then, to Jack's surprise, he extended a hand across the table. Well, I'm not going to say it's all forgotten, but it's a start. Maybe we can rebuild something, even if it's just a friendship. Jack shook his hand, feeling the weight of their shared history and the fragile threads of a possible future. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. As Jack left the bar later that night, he felt something new, a sense of connection, however fragile, starting to bloom. He had faced his father. He had reached out to his old friends. And although it wasn't always smooth, he was beginning to understand that rebuilding wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, even when it was hard, and doing the work, one small step at a time. Jack's days had become a blend of quiet reflection and small but significant changes. The past few weeks had been filled with difficult conversations, painful truths, and a slow but steady reconnection to the people he had once pushed away. But it was more than just the conversations. It was the work he had put into himself, the therapy, the introspection, the gradual letting go of anger, that was truly changing him. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came with instant gratification or dramatic transformations. It was a quieter, more patient kind of hope, a hope that things could get better, slowly but surely, as long as he kept trying. One afternoon, as Jack sat in Elon's office, sipping coffee and listening to the sound of a quiet, steady rain outside, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led him here. The conversation with Sarah, the brief, cautious reconnection with his father, the heartfelt conversation with Mike. He'd done the hard work. But now, the challenge was to keep moving forward. Elon leaned back in his chair, studying Jack carefully. "You've come a long way in a short amount of time," he said, his voice warm with a hint of pride. "How are you feeling about everything?" Jack shrugged, his eyes scanning the rain-soaked windows. I don't know. I guess I feel like I'm in a weird place. Things are better with some people, but others, it's like there's still a distance I can't cross. Elon nodded knowingly. That's part of the process. You're rebuilding your life, your relationships, your sense of self. It's not going to happen overnight, but you've made more progress than most people do in years. The key now is to keep focusing on the things you can control. Jack took another sip of coffee, mulling over Elon's words. "I just don't want to mess it all up again," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. Elon smiled faintly, the kind of smile that spoke of experience. "Jack, you'll mess up again. We all do. But that's not the point. The point is that you get up every time. You make a new choice. And you keep moving forward." For the first time in what felt like ages, Jack believed him. Maybe the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but at least now, Jack had the tools and the mindset to handle the bumps along the way. A week later, Jack was walking into a new chapter of his life, literally. His old apartment, the one he'd rented for years, had been sold. It was time to leave the old place behind. The same place where so many bad decisions had been made, where loneliness had been a constant companion, and where anger had poisoned his every thought. It had been a symbolic space for his old life, a life he was finally willing to walk away from. This time, though, he wasn't walking away to run. He was walking away to rebuild. Jack stood in front of the door, staring at the place that had once been home. He thought of all the nights spent in silence, of the walls that had seen his rage and his regrets. There was a finality to it now, a sense of closure he hadn't expected. With a deep breath, he turned the key for the last time. He didn't look back. The new apartment wasn't anything grand. It was a modest, two-bedroom place on the edge of town, the kind of place that didn't come with baggage. It was a fresh start, a place where Jack could take the next step in rebuilding his life. The walls were bare, the floors spotless. There were no old memories to haunt him here. When Elon came by to check out the new place, Jack could see the approval in his eyes. "You're not trying to fill the emptiness with stuff," Elon remarked, glancing around at the sparse but intentional furnishings. "That's important, Jack. It's easy to use possessions to cover up the things we're avoiding." Jack smiled, walking over to the window and gazing out at the city below. "I know. This time, it's about filling the emptiness with peace, and maybe a little more time spent with people who matter." Elon gave him a thoughtful nod. That's a good approach. The people you're building relationships with, the ones who are helping you grow, that's what's going to keep you grounded. Jack's eyes flickered toward his phone, where a text from Mike had come in just moments before. It read, "Hey, it's Mike. Wanted to let you know the band's playing again this weekend. Not sure if you're up for it, but you're welcome to join us if you feel like it." Jack's heart gave a little jolt. He hadn't played with the band in years, and while he had no illusions that everything would just fall into place the moment he walked through those doors, there was something about the invitation that felt different. It felt like an opportunity, not just to revisit an old part of his life, but to see if there was something worth salvaging. He texted back, "I'll be there." The night of the gig, Jack found himself standing backstage, his hands clammy, his heart racing in his chest. It was the same venue where they had played countless shows in the past, before everything had fallen apart. The same old smell of spilled beer and cigarette smoke. The same faces, albeit older, a little worn, but still familiar. The same anticipation in the air as the crowd buzzed in the background, waiting for the band to take the stage. He could hear the muffled sound of the drums and guitar from the other side of the curtain. Mike was on stage, probably rehearsing, and Jack could feel the pull of the music, the thrill of being part of something bigger than himself. When the band finished their sound check, Mike came backstage and greeted Jack with a nod. "You ready?" Jack took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, let's do this." They didn't have to talk much. The moment Jack picked up his guitar and stepped onto the stage, it all came back to him. The familiar rhythm, the connection with the band, the raw energy of live music. The crowd cheered as they launched into the first song, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The music flowed through him, a reminder of who he used to be and who he could be again. There was no pretending here, no anger, no regrets, just the present moment, the sound of his guitar, the rhythm of the drums, the harmony of the band. As the night went on, Jack realized something. He had spent so long trying to outrun his past, but here, in this moment, he wasn't running anymore. He was living. After the show, the band gathered at the bar, laughing and reminiscing about old times. Mike clapped Jack on the back. "Glad you came, man. It felt like old times. Maybe even better." Jack smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "Yeah, me too. It wasn't perfect. There was still a lot of work to be done. But for the first time in a long while, Jack wasn't afraid of the work ahead. He wasn't afraid of who he was becoming. The road to rebuilding his life wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take time, effort, and a lot of hard conversations. But Jack was ready to rebuild, to face whatever came next, and to embrace the new beginnings that were waiting for him. The first few weeks in his new apartment felt like an experiment. Everything was so new. His routines, his environment, his interactions. Jack was still getting used to the quiet, to the absence of the chaos that had once filled his days. It was almost unsettling at first, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. But nothing did. Each day passed by, uneventful, with small victories and quiet moments of peace. He kept up with his therapy sessions, where he continued to dig deeper into the roots of his anger and shame. And though the process was slow, Jack found that the more he explored his past, the more he began to understand the patterns that had shaped him. He wasn't the same person he had been just a few months ago, but he wasn't sure if that was enough. Not yet, at least. The real test, Jack knew, was patience. It wasn't long before the cracks in the facade began to show. Rebuilding wasn't as simple as Jack had hoped. He had thought that, with a little time, everything would fall into place. His relationship with his father would improve, his friends would come around, and the past would stay behind him. But that wasn't how it worked. Old wounds didn't heal overnight. Old habits didn't die easily. Jack's father, for example, still had trouble expressing emotions. The tentative steps toward reconciliation were slow, and more often than not, their conversations felt awkward and strained. There were still unspoken words between them, a distance that neither seemed able to bridge. And then there was Sarah. Despite the emotional breakthrough they had shared on the phone, things between them had not progressed. They hadn't seen each other in person since that day, and although they texted occasionally, there was an unspoken tension whenever they spoke. Jack couldn't help but wonder if he had waited too long to fix things with her. Had she truly moved on, or was she just waiting for him to prove that he had changed? One afternoon, as Jack sat in his apartment trying to focus on his writing, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. He hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. "Hey Jack, are you free to talk? I know it's been a while, but I think we need to have another conversation." His heart skipped a beat. He had wanted this for so long, but now that it was here, he didn't know what to say. What could he say? Was he ready for the truth? He took a deep breath and texted back, "Yeah, I'm free. When and where?" They decided to meet at a small coffee shop halfway between their places. When Jack arrived, Sarah was already sitting at a corner table, her eyes focused on her phone. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an awkwardness in the air that neither could seem to break. "Hey," Jack said, sitting down across from her. "Hey," Sarah replied, offering a small smile. But there was something guarded in her eyes, something that reminded Jack of how much time had passed since their last real conversation. After a few beats of silence, Sarah spoke up. "So, I guess we should just get into it. I've been thinking a lot about us, Jack, about everything that happened. And I think we both know that there's no going back to how things were. Not in the way we hoped." Jack's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words out loud still hit him like a punch to the gut. "I know," he said quietly, his voice low. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I wanted you to know that I've changed. I know I've hurt you, and I can't take that back, but I'm not the same person anymore." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze softening slightly. "I know you're not. But the thing is, Jack, change doesn't erase everything. We can't just ignore the past, no matter how much we wish we could. I've moved on, and I think it's time you did too." Jack swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. This was the moment he had feared the most, and yet, somehow, it didn't feel as devastating as he thought it would. "I don't want to lose you, Sarah. I wish I had done things differently." She reached across the table and placed her hand on his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know, Jack, but sometimes we can't fix things. Sometimes we just have to accept them for what they are." The pain was still there, sharp and raw, but Jack found that he wasn't drowning in it. The words were painful, but they were also freeing in a strange way. He had spent so much of his life trying to fix everything, trying to undo his mistakes, but this was something he couldn't fix. It was time to let go. "I understand," he said softly, "and I'm sorry. I'll always be sorry." They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them letting the weight of the conversation settle in. There were no big emotional outbursts, no dramatic confessions. Just two people who had shared a part of their lives, realizing that it was time to move forward in different directions. Finally, Sarah stood up, offering him one last smile. "Take care of yourself, Jack." "You too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. As Jack walked back to his apartment that afternoon, he felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the outcome he had wanted. It wasn't the closure he had hoped for, but it was something he could live with. He had faced the truth, accepted it, and let go. He had done the work, and now it was time to move on. The following days passed by slowly, each one a test of patience. Jack kept up his therapy sessions, continued to reach out to his friends, and spent time reflecting on his journey. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be more setbacks, more uncomfortable conversations, and more moments of doubt. But Jack was beginning to understand that life wasn't about rushing to an end. It was about living in the moments, even the difficult ones, and trusting that change would come in its own time. It wasn't the instant transformation he had hoped for. It wasn't the easy fix that so many people expected from their own journeys. But Jack had learned the most important lesson of all. True change didn't come overnight. It came in small, patient steps. And for the first time in a long time, Jack was okay with that. Jack had spent most of his life running from the consequences of his actions, trying to outrun his mistakes. But with each passing day, he realized that redemption wasn't something that could be achieved by simply avoiding the past. It was something that had to be faced head-on. And for the first time, he was ready. The morning after his conversation with Sarah, Jack woke up early, as was his new routine. He felt different, lighter, almost as though a weight had been lifted. There was no immediate fix to the heartache or regret, but there was clarity, a quiet understanding that his journey was far from over. It was just beginning. He had come to realize that redemption wasn't just about making amends with others, it was also about making peace with himself. For so long, Jack had been consumed by guilt, blaming himself for everything that had gone wrong in his life. The anger he had carried for so many years had clouded his judgment, but now he could see more clearly. Redemption, he knew, began with forgiveness. Not from others, but from himself. That afternoon, Jack went to his father's house. It had been a while since they had seen each other, and the distance between them had felt like an unspoken chasm. Jack wasn't sure how to bridge it, but he was determined to try. When he knocked on the door, his father answered immediately. The older man's face softened when he saw Jack standing there, but he said nothing. They stood there for a few awkward moments, neither knowing exactly what to say. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "Dad, can we talk?" His father stepped aside to let him in. "Of course. Come on in." They sat in the same living room where Jack had spent so many hours growing up. The walls were the same, the furniture mostly unchanged, but the air between them was different. There was tension, sure, but there was something else too. An unspoken understanding that they had both been waiting for this moment for a long time. Jack swallowed before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about how things have been between us over the years. And I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you, and I've hurt myself. Jack," his father interrupted, his voice steady. "I'm not perfect either. I've made mistakes. We both have." Jack looked at his father, surprised by his words. The old man had always been a rock, stoic, distant, and largely unemotional. For him to admit fault, to show vulnerability, was something Jack had never seen before. "I know," Jack said softly, "but I need to do better. I need to fix things. Not just with you, but with myself too. I've spent so long being angry, and I've been so focused on my own pain that I've never really seen how much I've hurt the people around me." His father looked at him, his gaze a little softer now. "Jack, you've always been hard on yourself. And you've always been hard on me, too. But maybe that's just how we both coped with things. I didn't know how to be the father you needed, and I'm sorry for that. I've tried in my own way, but I guess I didn't always show it." The weight of his father's words settled over Jack like a blanket, warm and heavy at the same time. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. There were no tears or heartfelt embraces, but it was real. It was honest. And in that moment, Jack realized that redemption wasn't always about fixing everything at once. Sometimes, it was just about opening the door for something new to grow. Later that week, Jack ran into Mike at a local bar. They hadn't talked much since the night of the gig, but Mike had been a steady presence in Jack's life, and their friendship felt like one of the few things that had remained constant. "Hey, man," Mike said, grinning as he spotted Jack at the bar. "It's been a while. How's it going?" Jack leaned back in his seat, the familiar noise of the bar surrounding them. "You know, it's going better. Actually." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Better? What's that supposed to mean?" Jack shrugged, a smile tugging at his lips. "Just trying to figure things out. You know, life." Mike gave him a knowing look. "That's some deep shit, bro. But hey, as long as you're not drinking yourself into oblivion again, I'm happy for you." Jack chuckled. "No, I'm trying something different this time. No more running from my problems." Mike seemed to consider this for a moment before he took a sip of his drink. "Good. You've been through a lot, man. You're not alone in this. We're all just trying to make it through, you know?" For a brief moment, Jack thought about how many people he had pushed away over the years, how many friendships he had let slip through his fingers because of his own stubbornness and pride. But Mike wasn't one of those people. Mike had always been there for him, even when Jack had been at his lowest. "Yeah," Jack said, meeting his friend's gaze. "I know." A few days later, Jack was sitting at home, flipping through his journal. He had started writing more regularly as a way to track his progress and understand his feelings. Writing had always been an outlet for him, a way to express the things he couldn't say out loud. As he read through the pages, something caught his eye. It was an entry from several months ago, just before everything had started to change. He had written about feeling stuck, about wanting to make things right but not knowing how. There was a line that stood out to him. "I want to be a man who is proud of who he is, not who he was." Jack paused, the weight of those words sinking in. He wasn't the person he had been then. He wasn't the man filled with anger and regret. He was someone new, someone who had learned the value of patience, of growth, of redemption, and he was still learning. The road to redemption wasn't linear. There were days when Jack still doubted himself, days when the weight of his past seemed too heavy to carry. But the key was in the work, the small, daily decisions that built toward a future he could be proud of. It wasn't easy, and there would be more setbacks, but Jack was finally beginning to understand that true redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and the only way forward was to keep moving, step by step. That evening, as Jack sat on his balcony, looking out at the city lights, he felt a deep sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't perfect. He hadn't fixed everything, but he was trying. And that, he realized, was enough. The road to redemption, Jack quickly realized, was not a straight path. It twisted and turned in ways he couldn't always predict. As much as he had tried to leave behind the mistakes and choices that had haunted him for years, there was still one lingering part of his past that he had yet to confront: his childhood. Jack had grown up in a home where love was often unspoken, and anger seemed to linger in the air like a constant shadow. His father had been a hard man, disciplined, often distant, and more focused on providing than nurturing. Jack didn't blame him for that, but he couldn't ignore how those years had shaped him. The years of fighting for attention, of never quite being good enough, had left scars on his soul. Scars that hadn't healed completely, even after all this time. Now, as he was navigating the process of healing, Jack knew he couldn't move forward without revisiting those old wounds. It was an overcast Saturday afternoon when Jack decided to make the trip back to his childhood home. His mother still lived there, though she had long since divorced his father. The house was familiar, yet strange to him now. So much time had passed since he'd left, and yet the memories still clung to the walls like an invisible fog. The drive there felt like an emotional tug-of-war. Part of him wanted to turn around, to avoid it, but another part of him knew that if he didn't face the past now, it would always linger in the background. He had already made so much progress in understanding who he was and where he wanted to go, but that progress felt incomplete without this one final confrontation. When he arrived, the house looked the same as it had when he was a teenager. Old, weathered, but still standing. Jack parked his car and took a deep breath. He didn't know what kind of reception he would get from his mother, but he knew it was time to try. He knocked on the door, and a moment later, it creaked open. His mother stood there, a faint smile on her face, but her eyes were tired. "Jack," she said softly, stepping back to let him in. "It's been a while." "Yeah," he replied, stepping into the house. It felt oddly comforting, and at the same time, suffocating. "I've been meaning to come by." They sat in the kitchen, the same place where so many of their conversations had taken place in the past. Jack felt the weight of the moment, but he pushed forward, knowing that he couldn't run from it anymore. "Mom," he began, his voice hesitant but determined, "I need to talk about Dad." His mother's face hardened slightly, but she didn't look away. "I don't know if there's much to say about him, Jack. You know what happened between us. You know how it ended." Jack nodded, feeling the familiar sting of old wounds. "I know, but that's not what I mean. I need to understand more about what happened when I was growing up. About him. About us." For a moment, his mother said nothing. She stared at her hands, as though trying to decide whether she wanted to go there. Jack had always known that she had her own unresolved pain when it came to his father. But now, for the first time, he needed her to share it with him, not just for his own sake, but for hers as well. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and strained. "Your father, he loved you, Jack, but he didn't know how to show it. He thought love was about providing, about making sure you had everything you needed. He didn't know how to connect with you emotionally. And honestly, I think that hurt both of you." Jack listened, absorbing her words. It was painful to hear, but it made sense. So many of the arguments and misunderstandings from his childhood suddenly clicked into place. It wasn't just his father's anger that had caused the rift. It was the lack of connection, the absence of the emotional bond that Jack had desperately needed but had never known how to ask for. "I guess I always just thought he didn't care," Jack said quietly. "But maybe it wasn't that simple." His mother sighed, rubbing her temples. "No, it wasn't. But at the time, I didn't know how to fix it either. Your father and I were so busy with our own struggles that we didn't see how much you were hurting. And I'm sorry for that, Jack. I wish I could have done more." There it was, the apology Jack had longed for. But now, it didn't have the power it once would have. It didn't erase the years of tension and silence, but it offered something more valuable than he had expected: understanding. "It's okay, Mom," he said, his voice steady. "I get it now. It wasn't just you or Dad. It was both of you, and it was me too." She looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I wasn't easy to deal with. I was angry, and I pushed you both away. I never gave you a chance to really understand me, because I didn't understand myself." Jack paused, feeling the weight of his words. "But I'm trying to understand now, and I need you to know that." His mother smiled, the faintest glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that, Jack. I truly am. And I'm proud of you for facing all of this." The conversation shifted after that. They talked more about his childhood, about the things that had shaped him, and about the mistakes they had all made. It wasn't a perfect conversation. It wasn't some magical moment of healing. But it was progress. Real progress. As Jack left his mother's house later that day, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The past still lingered, of course, but it no longer had the same power over him. By facing it, by speaking the truth, he had taken away its hold. The drive back to his apartment was quieter than usual, and Jack found himself reflecting on everything he had learned that day. He had spent so much time running from the pain, from the things he couldn't change. But now, he understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, accepting it, and moving forward. When Jack arrived home, he didn't feel the overwhelming rush of emotions that he thought would come. Instead, there was a peacefulness inside him, a quiet strength that had come from confronting the truth. That night, as Jack sat on his balcony once more, he looked out over the city. It was as though he had crossed another threshold, stepping further into the man he was becoming. The road to redemption was still long, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Because, as he had learned, redemption wasn't something you could earn by simply trying to be good. It wasn't about the perfect choices or the perfect outcomes. It was about being honest, being present, and being willing to face the parts of yourself that you'd rather leave buried. Jack had faced his past that day, and in doing so, he had taken another step toward his future. The next few weeks were some of the most transformative in Jack's life. There was a lightness to his days now, a sense of freedom he hadn't known in years. The conversation with his mother had peeled back layers of pain, exposing raw truths that he had spent most of his life avoiding. But now, he could finally breathe again. The weight of his past, while still there, was no longer a burden he carried on his shoulders. Jack had made the decision to start fresh, to leave behind the ghosts of his old life. He knew that the road to redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes or pretending that they didn't exist. It was about learning, growing, and making a commitment to move forward with a clear mind and an open heart. One crisp morning, Jack woke up early, a rare occurrence for him, but something felt different today. It was the first day in years he hadn't woken up feeling heavy. Instead, there was a quiet sense of optimism hanging in the air. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this clarity until now. He sat at his kitchen table, the morning sun spilling through the windows. Jack had spent a lot of time reflecting on the changes he wanted to make. He wanted to move forward, really move forward. The apartment he had been renting, with its empty walls and stale memories, no longer felt like a place he could grow. He needed a fresh start, a new space to match the person he was becoming. A thought crossed his mind. Why not take the plunge and move somewhere new? Maybe it was time to leave the city behind, to find a place that could truly represent his new beginning. Jack had always dreamed of living in the mountains. There was something about the solitude of nature that called to him, something peaceful about the idea of waking up surrounded by nothing but trees, fresh air, and quiet. He grabbed his phone and started searching for properties. Before he knew it, he had made the decision. He would move to the small town of Breckenridge, Colorado. It felt like a bold choice, but Jack knew that it was the right one. It wasn't just about the place. It was about what it represented. It was a symbol of the change he was embracing. The mountains, the silence, the space. All of it would give him room to think, to grow, to find himself in ways he hadn't been able to in the hustle and noise of the city. Later that week, Jack packed up his things. Most of them were just old boxes filled with clutter, remnants of a life he was leaving behind. He had already given away most of his belongings to friends, focusing only on the essentials. It wasn't about starting over with nothing, but rather simplifying, shedding the excess, and making room for what mattered. When the moving truck arrived, he didn't feel the pang of regret he had anticipated. Instead, there was an excitement he hadn't expected, a sense of relief. He was letting go. It wasn't just about moving to a new place physically. It was about leaving behind the baggage that had weighed him down for so long. He was finally ready to let go of the anger, the guilt, the hurt. By the time Jack had arrived in Breckenridge, he felt like a different person. The small town was exactly what he had imagined, quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by majestic mountains. There was a certain magic in the air here, something that calmed his restless soul and allowed him to take a deep breath. It felt like he had entered a new chapter of his life, one where the possibilities were endless. As Jack settled into his new home, he realized that he wasn't just running from his past anymore. He was actively creating his future. Each day was a chance to rewrite the story he had been living, to mold himself into the man he had always wanted to be. There was no grand ceremony or instant transformation, but Jack began to notice small changes in himself. He started walking more, taking long, contemplative hikes in the mountains, and each time he reached the top of a trail, he felt a sense of accomplishment that had eluded him for years. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was moving forward, one step at a time, building the life he had always wanted but never had the courage to pursue. A few weeks into his new life, Jack met a woman named Emily at a local coffee shop. She was warm and easy to talk to, with an easy smile and a love for the outdoors that mirrored his own. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their pasts, their dreams, and everything in between. Emily was different from anyone Jack had ever met. She didn't expect him to be perfect. She didn't want him to pretend to be someone he wasn't. She accepted him for who he was, flaws and all. Their friendship blossomed quickly, and soon, they were spending most of their weekends hiking together, exploring the mountain trails that Jack had fallen in love with. Emily never asked about his past in a way that made him uncomfortable. She let him tell his story when he was ready. And for the first time, Jack felt like he could be completely himself without fear of judgment. One evening, as they watched the sun set over the mountains, Emily turned to Jack and asked, "What made you move here, Jack? I mean, Breckenridge is beautiful, but it's also kind of far away from everything." Jack smiled, his gaze distant for a moment as he thought about the journey that had led him here. "I guess I needed a fresh start. I wanted to be somewhere I could breathe, somewhere I could really think and figure out who I am, you know?" Emily nodded, her eyes kind and understanding. "That makes sense. I think we all need that at some point." Jack took a deep breath, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Yeah, and I think I'm finally ready to live the life I've always wanted. A life where I'm not afraid of my past anymore." For the first time in a long time, Jack realized that the road to redemption wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about having the courage to begin anew. It was about choosing to create a future based on who you wanted to be, not who you had been. As he looked out over the mountains, Jack felt a quiet sense of pride. He had come so far. There would still be challenges ahead. There would always be challenges, but for the first time in his life, he knew he was ready to face them. Jack had spent years searching for answers, running from his past, and trying to make sense of his mistakes. But in Breckenridge, amidst the quiet beauty of the mountains, he began to realize that the answers hadn't been out there in the world, waiting for him to find them. They were inside him all along. It wasn't something he could describe in concrete terms. It wasn't an epiphany or a moment of enlightenment. It was more like a feeling, a quiet certainty that had grown steadily over the past few months, as though a door had been unlocked deep inside him. It was the understanding that he was enough, just as he was. But this new self-awareness came with its own set of challenges. Jack was no longer the person he had been when he left the city. He had changed, and he could feel the weight of that change in his daily life. It wasn't easy, of course. Every day felt like a battle, one step forward, two steps back. But he had learned to embrace those steps, to see them not as setbacks but as part of his growth. It was early one morning when Jack decided to take a different path. He had been hiking the same trails for months now, the familiar routes through the mountains offering him peace and a place to reflect. But today, something inside him urged him to push further, to explore beyond what was comfortable. He laced up his boots, packed a small bag with water and snacks, and headed out before the sun had fully risen. The cold mountain air was sharp against his face, and the quiet of the early morning felt like a world apart from the bustle of everyday life. As he trekked deeper into the forest, the feeling of solitude washed over him in waves. There was no one here but him, and he was starting to appreciate that fact. As Jack moved higher up the mountain, the terrain grew more rugged. The trail was less defined, and he had to be more mindful of where he stepped. But with each challenging step, Jack felt a deeper connection to the land, to the earth beneath his feet. It was as though the mountains were speaking to him, telling him that there was strength to be found in every obstacle, in every challenge. By the time Jack reached the summit, the sun had begun to rise, casting a soft golden light over the valley below. He paused, out of breath, but feeling more alive than he had in years. There was something profoundly humbling about standing at the top of a mountain, knowing that you had conquered it, that you had pushed yourself to go further than you thought possible. Jack sat on a large rock, staring out at the vastness of the world around him. The view was breathtaking, miles and miles of untouched wilderness, stretching out as far as the eye could see. He felt small in comparison, yet somehow, in this moment, he also felt incredibly powerful. The strength Jack had been searching for had always been within him. It wasn't about running away from his past or hiding from his mistakes. It was about facing them head-on and finding the courage to move forward. Every challenge, every struggle, had been building him up, even when he couldn't see it. As he sat there, Jack realized that he had stopped searching for answers in the wrong places. He had spent so many years looking for validation from others, seeking approval, trying to prove that he was worthy. But now, he understood that worthiness came from within. It wasn't about what others thought of him. It was about what he thought of himself. The hike down the mountain was quieter than the ascent. Jack took his time, savoring the peace he felt in his chest. He thought about the future, about what he wanted from life. There were still uncertainties, but he wasn't afraid of them anymore. He had the tools now to face whatever came his way. When Jack returned to his cabin that afternoon, there was a sense of calm within him that hadn't been there before. He felt connected to himself in a way he never had. The world didn't seem as daunting as it once did. It wasn't perfect, and life would still present its challenges, but Jack knew that he had the strength to meet them, no matter what. The next few days were a quiet reflection of Jack's growth. He spent time with Emily, who had become not just a friend, but someone he was beginning to trust more deeply. They continued to hike together, explore new trails, and share conversations that spanned everything from the lighthearted to the profound. With Emily, Jack was finally learning how to let his guard down, how to embrace vulnerability without fear. One evening, as they sat by a fire outside Jack's cabin, Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "You've changed, Jack," she said, her voice soft. "I can see it. I think you're finally starting to believe in yourself." Jack smiled, poking at the fire with a stick. "I think I am," he replied. "I've been running from myself for so long. But now, I think I'm starting to see the real me, the one that was always there." Emily nodded. "I think that's beautiful. But it's not just about believing in yourself. It's about taking action, about doing things that align with who you really are." Jack paused, looking into the fire, and then back at her. "Yeah, you're right. It's one thing to believe you're strong, but it's another thing to actually use that strength." That night, as Jack lay in bed, He realized that Emily's words were exactly what he needed to hear. It wasn't enough to simply understand that he had strength. He had to apply it. He had to take risks, push himself further, and act on the beliefs he had started to develop about himself. The following morning, Jack woke up early, his mind racing with new ideas. He knew that it was time to start taking those next steps. He needed to find a purpose, something to focus on that would challenge him and help him grow even more. He began researching ways he could give back to the community, ways he could help others who had faced struggles like his own. He thought about the time he had spent in the city, about the people he had met who were struggling with addiction, violence, or broken families. He had been one of them once. Maybe it was time to use his story to help others. As Jack sat at his desk, researching volunteer opportunities and organizations that focused on supporting at-risk youth, he felt something stir inside him, a new sense of purpose. Maybe this was the next step. Maybe this was what he had been searching for all along. A way to use his own experiences to make a difference in someone else's life. Jack had been through so much, and now he was beginning to see that the strength he had found in the mountains wasn't just physical. It was the strength to face the future, to turn the pain of the past into something meaningful, and to help others do the same. The decision to help others wasn't an easy one for Jack. It required more than just volunteering his time. It meant confronting the very parts of himself he had spent so long avoiding. The pain of his past, his mistakes, his struggles, was still there, but now, he saw it as something he could use for good. He wasn't ashamed of who he had been. Instead, he was determined to turn that story into something that could inspire others. Jack spent the next few weeks researching organizations that focused on youth mentorship, particularly those that worked with at-risk teens. He felt a calling to work with kids who were struggling with their own demons. Kids who, like him, felt lost and disconnected from the world around them. After a few weeks of emailing, calling, and setting up meetings, Jack finally got an interview with a local nonprofit called Pathways to Change. It was a mentoring program that paired older adults with troubled teens to provide guidance and support. Jack knew this was where he was meant to be. The day of the interview arrived, and Jack found himself pacing outside the office, his nerves on edge. He had never been great at formal settings, but this felt different. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the opportunity to step into a new role, one that wasn't just about him, but about others. When he walked into the office, he was greeted by Sarah, the program director. She was in her late 30s, with a warm smile and a no-nonsense attitude. Her eyes were kind but sharp, like someone who had seen it all and wasn't easily fooled. "Jack, nice to meet you," she said, extending a hand. "I've read your resume, but I want to hear your story. What brought you here?" Jack hesitated for a moment, but then the words began to flow. He told Sarah about his past, about his troubled childhood, his mistakes, and his time spent running from everything that had shaped him. He explained how he had finally come to terms with his past, and how he wanted to help others who were struggling the way he once had. Sarah listened intently, nodding occasionally. When Jack finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied him for a moment. "You know," she said, "I think you're exactly what we need here. You've been where these kids are. You understand the pain, the anger, the confusion. They need to see someone who has walked that path and come out the other side." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Could it really be this simple? Could his past, the very thing he had spent years trying to escape, be the key to making a difference? "I want to help," Jack said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I know what it feels like to be lost. I want to help them find their way." Over the next few weeks, Jack began his training with Pathways to Change. He learned the ins and outs of the program, how to build trust with at-risk youth, and how to be a mentor who didn't just listen, but actively guided. He was paired with a young man named Tyler, a 16-year-old who had been in and out of juvenile detention for most of his life. Tyler had a tough exterior, but Jack could see past it. He saw the same pain and frustration he had once felt, and it made him more determined than ever to help. Their first meeting was awkward, to say the least. Tyler was defensive, refusing to make eye contact, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Jack sat across from him, trying to read the situation. It took several attempts to even get Tyler to speak, but slowly, over time, Jack's persistence paid off. They started with small conversations, talking about sports, music, and life in general. Tyler wasn't ready to open up about his struggles, but Jack wasn't in a rush. He understood the walls Tyler had built around himself. He had been there too. One afternoon, a breakthrough finally came. Jack and Tyler were sitting on a park bench, the crisp fall air swirling around them. Tyler had been unusually quiet, and Jack was starting to wonder if this was the day he'd lose him, if the kid would decide he wasn't interested in mentoring after all. But then, without warning, Tyler spoke. "My dad," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's never been around. And now, my mom's with some new guy who's just not cool. I hate him." Jack listened intently, his heart aching for Tyler. He could hear the anger and abandonment in his voice. It was familiar. It was a feeling he had lived with for years. "I get it, man," Jack said quietly. "I didn't have the best relationship with my dad, either. And there were times when I thought my life would never get better. But it does. It takes time, but it does. You've got to decide if you're going to let that stuff tear you down, or if you're going to use it to become something stronger." Tyler looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't know what it's like. You don't know what I've been through." Jack smiled softly. "Maybe not. But I've been through enough to know that we don't have to be defined by what happened to us. We get to choose who we want to be." Tyler didn't respond immediately, but Jack could see the gears turning in his head, the skepticism giving way to curiosity. Over the following months, Jack continued to meet with Tyler regularly. He showed up, day after day, not because it was easy, but because he knew that sometimes just being there was enough. Tyler started to open up more, to share his frustrations, his fears, and slowly, his dreams. It wasn't a straight path. There were setbacks, moments when Tyler pushed Jack away, when he tried to sabotage their progress. But Jack didn't give up. He knew that Tyler needed to see that someone cared, someone believed in him. The more Jack worked with Tyler, the more he realized that this mission, this purpose, wasn't just about fixing others. It was about sharing the journey, being a part of someone else's story, and offering a hand when they needed it most. And in doing so, Jack found something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for, a deep sense of fulfillment. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, Tyler turned to Jack as they were walking back to their cars. "Thanks, man," Tyler said, his voice quieter than usual. I'm not saying I trust you yet, but I think I could. You're different from the others." Jack smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "I'm not perfect, Tyler. I'm just trying to help however I can." Tyler nodded. "Yeah, I get that. I think I'm gonna try. I really am." And in that moment, Jack realized something profound. This was what he had been waiting for. This was his purpose. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about showing up every day with a willingness to change, not just for himself, but for the people around him. As the months passed, Jack found himself deeply entrenched in his work at Pathways to Change. He wasn't just mentoring Tyler anymore. He was building connections with other kids in the program, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. The impact of his transformation wasn't just personal. It had begun to spread, like the ripple effect of a stone dropped into a still pond. At first, Jack had only been focused on helping Tyler. But now, he realized that his journey had a much wider reach. The teens in the program weren't just looking for someone to tell them what to do. They needed someone who understood the depths of their pain. They needed someone who had fought the same battles and come out on the other side. Jack's story, his struggles, had become a lifeline for these kids, and the more he shared, the more they opened up. He had begun to see patterns. Kids like Darnell, who had a history of violence but a natural gift for art. Emma, a shy girl who had been bullied for years and thought she would never fit in. And Carlos, a young man with a passion for computers but little confidence. They all had their own stories, their own scars, but they also had one thing in common. They didn't believe in themselves. And Jack? He understood them all too well. One day, after a particularly powerful group session where Jack had shared his experience with addiction and how he had fought through it, Darnell approached him, his face serious. "Yo, Jack," Darnell said, his voice low. "I don't get it. How did you do it? How'd you get past all that? Like, what makes you different?" Jack glanced over at Darnell, his heart heavy with the weight of the question. He knew this was a moment of truth, a moment where he could either be real or fail to reach him. I didn't get past it alone, Jack replied, his tone genuine. I had to face it, and every day, I had to choose to keep moving forward. You want to know what makes me different? I don't quit on myself anymore. Darnell raised an eyebrow, a half-smile creeping up on his face. That sounds a little corny, man. Jack chuckled softly. Yeah, maybe it does. But it's true. If you keep running from your demons, they'll chase you down. But if you face them head-on, they lose their power over you. Darnell nodded slowly, clearly processing what Jack had said. He wasn't sure he believed it yet, but Jack knew it was a seed he had planted. The next day, Jack received a call from Sarah. She sounded excited, her voice buzzing with energy. Jack, I've been talking to some of the other staff, and we all agree. Your work with the kids has been incredible. You've been making a real difference here. We've been discussing expanding the mentorship program, and I'd love for you to help lead some of the new initiatives. Are you interested? Jack didn't hesitate. Absolutely. It wasn't just about Tyler anymore, or Darnell, or any of the other kids. It was about the bigger picture. Jack realized that he could be a catalyst for change, not just for the teens he worked with directly, but for the entire community. And if he was going to make that kind of impact, he needed to step up, to be more than just a mentor. He needed to become a leader. Over the next few weeks, Jack worked closely with Sarah and the rest of the team to develop new programs. They launched workshops focused on life skills, conflict resolution, and emotional intelligence, skills that Jack wished he'd learned earlier in life. They also created a mentorship training program for new volunteers, helping them understand the unique challenges the kids in their program faced. But perhaps the most significant change Jack saw wasn't in the structure of the program. It was in the kids themselves. Tyler had made incredible progress. While Jack had initially been the one to encourage Tyler to speak out, it was Tyler who, in a recent group session, had opened up to the entire room about his struggles. He talked about his family, his anger, and how he used to think the world owed him something. And then, with surprising humility, Tyler said, I'm not there yet, but I'm trying. I want to get better. That moment, more than anything else, showed Jack how far they had come. Tyler was learning to own his story, just as Jack had learned to own his. And as the months passed, Tyler began to believe in himself, a belief that had ripple effects not just for him, but for everyone around him. One evening, after a long day of mentoring, Jack took a walk along the lake near the center. The sun was setting, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange. He hadn't realized how much he needed this quiet moment of reflection. As he walked, he thought about the changes he had undergone over the past year. He thought about the pain he had endured and the mistakes he had made. He thought about the times he had wanted to give up, to just walk away from it all. But now, as he looked back, he saw that every misstep had led him here. Every failure had been a lesson. And now, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Jack stopped by the water's edge, letting the cool breeze wash over him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Emily. Hey, I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. I see the way you're changing lives, and I'm really impressed. You've come so far. Jack smiled at the message, his heart swelling with gratitude. Emily had been there for him from the start, and her support had meant everything. He quickly typed back, Thanks, Emily. Couldn't have done it without your encouragement. But as he stood there, staring out at the calm water, Jack realized that the person who had made the biggest difference in his life was himself. It had been his decision to change, his choice to stop running from his past, and his willingness to face his fears. And now, he was making a difference for others, teaching them the same thing. The following week, Sarah called Jack into her office again. She looked even more excited than before. Jack, I have great news. One of the local high schools has reached out to us. They want to partner with Pathways to change to offer mentorship programs for students in need. They've heard about the work we're doing, and they're eager to get involved. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The ripple effect was starting to expand, to reach beyond just the kids in their program. The whole community was beginning to see the value in what they were doing. I'm in, Jack said, his voice steady but full of conviction. Good. I knew you'd say that, Sarah replied with a smile. We need someone who's been through the struggle, someone who can really speak to these kids. I think you're the perfect person for this. As Jack left Sarah's office that day, he felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. But he also felt something else, hope. Hope that the work they were doing would continue to grow, that more kids would find the strength to change their own lives. It wasn't just about one person. It was about a community coming together, each small act of change spreading outward, creating a wave that could transform lives, one at a time. The community around Jack had transformed in ways he had never expected. What started as a single mentor-mentee relationship between him and Tyler had blossomed into something bigger, a movement of growth, healing, and possibility. The kids who once felt discarded were now finding their voices, their purpose. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but every small victory was a testament to the power of persistence. Jack had become a leader in the Pathways to Change program, not just because he was passionate about mentoring, but because he lived and breathed the message of resilience. He showed up, day after day, not because he was perfect, but because he had learned that being real, being vulnerable, was what made him the most effective mentor. One crisp morning, Jack was preparing for the monthly community outreach event. The event had started small, just a few volunteers gathering to paint murals or clean up local parks. But now, it had grown. Local businesses sponsored it. Teachers, parents, and students all participated. It was a celebration of the work they had done, and more importantly, a reflection of how far they had come together. Jack arrived at the event early to help set up. As he unloaded supplies from his truck, Darnell approached him, holding a large canvas with vibrant colors swirling across it. The painting depicted a group of young people reaching out toward the horizon, with a road winding through the center. "What's this?" Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. Darnell grinned, handing it over. "This is the mural I've been working on. I wanted it to be a reminder, that no matter where we start, we can always go further. And even when the road's tough, we keep moving." Jack studied the painting, feeling a lump form in his throat. This was Darnell, who had once been so angry, so unwilling to trust anyone, now channeling his emotions into something that would inspire others. "This is amazing, Darnell," Jack said, his voice a little hoarse. "You've come so far, man." Darnell shrugged, but there was a proud glint in his eyes. "I guess I'm starting to believe it, that I can do something more with my life." Later that day, the community event kicked off, drawing in crowds from all over the city. There were booths with local vendors, workshops on personal growth, and of course, the unveiling of Darnell's mural. As the community gathered, Jack couldn't help but look around and take it all in. It wasn't just about the event or the mural. It was about the lives that had been touched, the kids who had found hope in places they once thought were hopeless. Tyler had been helping behind the scenes, carrying boxes and arranging chairs. He didn't say much, but Jack noticed how he had started to take initiative. He was no longer the boy who showed up late or skipped out on meetings. He was part of something bigger, and it was beginning to show in his actions. As the event drew to a close, Jack stood by the mural, watching the kids interact with it. Many of them had already taken photos in front of it, using their phones to capture the moment. Jack overheard a few of them talking. "I think Darnell's mural is going to inspire a lot of people," one of them said. "It's like, no matter how bad things get, you can always move forward." "Yeah, it's like you're not alone," another one added. "Like you've got people with you, every step of the way." Jack smiled, his heart swelling. This was what it was all about. This was the legacy, the ripple effect he had hoped to create. The kids weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. They were starting to believe that their stories weren't defined by their pasts, but by what they chose to do with their futures. A few weeks later, Jack was sitting in a small cafe with Emily, who had been his unwavering support throughout his journey. She had always been there to listen, to challenge him, and to remind him of his worth, even on the toughest days. Now, as they sat across from one another, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for her. "I can't believe how far things have come," Emily said, sipping her coffee. "You've completely transformed the lives of so many kids, Jack. You've shown them what's possible when you don't give up on yourself." Jack shook his head, a modest smile on his face. "I'm just one part of it, Emily. It's not just me. It's the community, the volunteers, The kids themselves. They've done the hard work. I'm just here to guide them. She reached across the table, placing a hand on his. But you gave them something they needed. You gave them hope. And that's everything. Jack looked at her, his heart full. I couldn't have done it without you. You've been there for me from the beginning, even when I was too lost to know what I was doing. Emily smiled warmly. I always knew you had it in you. And now, look at the impact you're making. You're changing the narrative, Jack. You're leaving a legacy. Jack nodded, the weight of her words settling in. He had come a long way from the reckless, angry biker who had kicked a dog for fun. Now, his mission was clear: to help others find their way out of darkness and into the light of possibility. And as he thought about the work still to be done, he felt a deep sense of peace. That evening, as Jack sat in his apartment, reflecting on the progress he had made, he thought about the young people whose lives had intersected with his. He thought about Tyler, Darnell, Emma, and all the others who had learned to believe in themselves. They weren't just kids who needed saving. They were individuals capable of transforming their own lives. And Jack? He was simply a guide, a witness to their growth. He picked up his phone and sent a quick message to Sarah. We're just getting started. I can feel it. The best is yet to come. As he hit send, Jack stood up and walked to the window. The city lights twinkled below, and he could see people going about their lives, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place beneath the surface. He smiled to himself. The ripples were getting bigger. Change was happening, and Jack was right in the middle of it. It had been over a year since Jack first walked through the doors of Pathways to Change, a man broken by his past, trying to find redemption. And now, standing at the front of a room full of young faces, some familiar and some new, he realized just how far he had come. What started as a personal mission to find his own way had transformed into a full-blown movement. A movement that was no longer just about him. All right, everyone, Jack said, his voice strong and clear. Today, we're going to do something a little different. The teens in the room shifted in their seats, glancing at one another. Jack had a way of making the atmosphere electric. When he spoke, you could feel it in the air. There was a weight to his words. They were real. They mattered. We're going to start by talking about why we're here. Not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it. Why did we choose to show up today? Jack's eyes scanned the room, meeting each of their gazes. Because it's easy to just show up, but it's the why that keeps us going. The why is what keeps us fighting when everything else seems too hard. He paused, letting the silence hang for a moment before adding, and I'm here to tell you, the reason doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be some big, heroic moment. But if you know your why, if you believe in it, you'll keep going, no matter what. Tyler was one of the first to speak up. He had grown a lot since his first days at the center, his walls slowly crumbling as Jack continued to mentor him. But even now, he struggled with the deeper questions, the ones that pulled at him when the room was empty. I guess my why is simple, Tyler said, his voice slightly shaky, yet confident. I'm here because I don't want to be like the people I used to hang around with. I used to think that being tough was all that mattered. But now I see, it's more than that. It's about being something better. For myself. For my mom. For my little sister. Jack's heart swelled with pride. Tyler had come so far. The young man who had once been angry and lost was now driven by purpose. That, more than anything, proved that change wasn't just possible. It was real. That's a great why, Tyler, Jack said, giving him a nod of approval. And it's one that'll keep you going. It's not always easy, but if you keep showing up for yourself, for your family, that's when things start to shift. Over the next hour, more kids shared their reasons for being there. Some spoke about escaping the streets, others about wanting to make something of themselves. Some were quiet, still hesitant, but Jack could see it in their eyes. They were thinking, considering, opening up. After the session ended, Jack stayed behind to talk to a few of the new kids who had joined recently. One of them, a shy girl named Emma, had only been attending for a few weeks. She had a quiet, reserved demeanor, and Jack could see the weight of her past in the way she carried herself. Hey, Emma, how's it going? Jack asked gently, making sure to approach her without overwhelming her. Emma hesitated, then spoke softly. I'm I'm just trying to figure out if this place is really for me. Jack smiled, his voice calm. I get it. It can feel weird at first, but the fact that you're here means something. It means you're ready to make a change. And sometimes that's all it takes, to be ready. Emma looked up at him, a flicker of something uncertain but hopeful in her eyes. I don't know if I can change. I've messed up so much. You haven't messed up, Jack said firmly. You've made mistakes, just like I did. But the difference now is that you're here. You're taking a step forward. And that's all that matters. You don't have to have it all figured out today. You just have to be willing to try. Later that evening, as Jack was heading home, he reflected on the day's session. He had made a habit of these small moments of reflection, especially now that his work had grown into something larger than he could have imagined. Pathways to Change was now serving hundreds of kids, and the ripple effect he had started had reached places Jack hadn't even dreamed of. He had become more than just a mentor. He was a symbol of redemption, a living proof that it was possible to change. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about him anymore. He had become a part of something bigger, something that was bigger than any one person's story. The phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He checked it quickly. Emily had sent him a message. How's the session going? Hope everything went well. Jack smiled to himself and typed a response. It was amazing. The kids are getting it. They're starting to believe in their own potential. I can feel the shift happening. It's real this time. I'm so proud of you, Jack. You're doing incredible work. Jack sat back in his truck for a moment, taking in Emily's words. The truth was, he had never imagined he would be here, making an impact, changing lives, and leaving a legacy. He had been so caught up in his own pain, his own brokenness, that he had never thought about the possibility of a future where he could be a source of hope for others. But now, with the community rallying behind him, and with the kids like Tyler and Darnell continuing to grow, Jack realized that the real gift wasn't just in the work he was doing. It was in what was happening to him in the process. He had come full circle. The man who had once been selfish, reckless, and lost had now become a man who could see the potential in others and, more importantly, help them see it in themselves. A week later, Jack found himself standing in front of a much larger group. This time, it wasn't just the teens he mentored. This time, it was the parents, the volunteers, and the donors who had supported Pathways to Change. The organization had hosted a fundraising dinner to support the expanding programs. It was a celebration, a recognition of all the hard work everyone had put in. Jack stood at the podium, looking out over the crowd. He had always been more comfortable behind the scenes, but tonight was different. Tonight, he knew that everything he had been working toward was real, tangible. He cleared his throat and smiled. I'm not the same guy who first walked through the doors of this place. And I know that each one of you has your own story, your own reason for being here. But we're all here because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. We believe in the power of change. We believe that no matter what our past looks like, our future is up to us. Together, we're building a legacy of change. The room erupted into applause, and Jack's heart swelled with pride. He wasn't just part of something bigger now. He was helping to build it, brick by brick. As the applause died down, Jack took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling in. His work was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time, Jack felt truly at peace with the journey he had walked. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was ready. Jack's heart beat with a steady rhythm, the familiar pulse of determination that had guided him through his darkest days. But tonight, it wasn't the rush of adrenaline or fear that stirred him. It was a quiet understanding. The work he had started, the community he had helped build, was continuing to grow, and it was clear that the momentum wasn't stopping. It was a movement now, a living, breathing force. And Jack was just one piece of it. A month had passed since the fundraising dinner. Jack had kept busy overseeing the new programs that were being introduced, meeting with parents, and mentoring the kids who had started to show real promise. But now, the time had come for a new chapter, a new challenge. The Pathways to Change program had been given the chance to expand into schools, a golden opportunity that had Jack both excited and nervous. It was one thing to mentor a small group of kids who had already walked through the doors of the program, kids who had made the first decision to turn their lives around. but reaching out to a broader audience. Kids who might not yet know they need help, that was a whole new ballgame. He sat down at his desk, flipping through a stack of reports. It had been a long week of planning and strategizing, and though Jack had always been good at fighting for a cause, this was different. He wasn't just fighting for a cause anymore. He was fighting for the future of the kids he had come to care about. He was fighting for the future of the community that had helped him heal. His phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "I was thinking about what you said the other day, about how everything we've built is just the beginning. I really believe you're onto something, Jack. You've created something that will last." Jack smiled as he typed a quick response. "I hope so. It's not just about the kids anymore, Emily. It's about the legacy we're building, for everyone. We're creating a place where change can happen, for the long haul. It's going to take time, but I know we're on the right track." "I couldn't agree more," she replied. "And I'm so proud of you." Later that week, Jack found himself standing in front of a room full of teachers and school administrators. It was the first of many meetings about expanding the Pathways to Change program into local schools, and the pressure was starting to set in. But as he looked around the room, he noticed something unexpected. They weren't just looking at him with skepticism or doubt. There was curiosity in their eyes. They were interested, even eager. "I know you all are used to seeing kids in your classrooms every day, working through their struggles," Jack began, pacing in front of the group. "But I'm here to tell you that what you see isn't always the full picture. For a lot of these kids, the struggles go deeper than what they show on the surface. It's not just about grades or behavior. It's about what's happening inside. The questions they're asking themselves, the battles they're fighting that no one can see." He paused, letting his words settle in. What Pathways to Change offers is a way for kids to see beyond their circumstances. We offer them hope, a belief in their own ability to change. It's about showing them they're not defined by their mistakes or the things they've been through. It's about showing them that they have a choice. And with that choice, they can rewrite their story. Jack saw a few nods around the room. Teachers were leaning forward now, listening intently. That was when he realized they weren't just here to talk about programs, they were here to talk about the future. He finished his presentation with one final thought. This is not just a program. This is a movement, and I want you all to be a part of it. Together, we can change lives, not just for the kids, but for the entire community. This is bigger than any one of us. It's bigger than a single classroom. It's about building a new generation, a generation that believes in themselves and in their future. By the end of the meeting, the school administrators were excited. They agreed to implement Pathways to Change as part of their school-wide initiative to support at-risk students. Jack left the building with a new sense of purpose, feeling like he had just taken a huge step forward. This was the next phase of his journey, and it was just as challenging as he had imagined. But it was also rewarding. The chance to effect real, long-term change in the school system was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. As he drove home, Jack reflected on how far he had come. The kid who had once kicked a dog for fun, who had been angry, reckless, and lost. He was now standing at the helm of a movement that was shifting the very foundations of his community. The story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone he had met along the way. That evening, as Jack sat in his apartment, he received a call from Tyler. Tyler had been quiet lately, working hard at school, staying out of trouble. But Jack knew something was up when Tyler's voice cracked as he said, "Hey, Jack, I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been thinking about doing more, giving back, I guess." Jack leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, more?" Tyler paused. I've been thinking about mentoring. I know I'm not perfect, but I've learned a lot from you. And I want to be that person for someone else. I want to help them the way you helped me." Jack felt a surge of pride in his chest. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when one of his mints would step up and take on the role of a mentor themselves. "That's amazing, Tyler," Jack said, his voice filled with warmth. "I'm proud of you, man. You've come a long way. I think you're going to be an incredible mentor. If you need anything, you know I'm here." Tyler let out a relieved laugh. "Thanks, Jack. I just wanted you to know. I'll do whatever it takes to help others see that they can change, too." Jack ended the call with a smile, his heart swelling with pride. Tyler wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. And now, He was passing that gift on to someone else. A week later, Darnell came by Jack's office to talk. He had been making strides, both personally and professionally. He was working part-time at a local bike shop and had started volunteering with the program, helping out with the younger kids who were just starting to come in. "I've been thinking about something, Jack," Darnell said, his voice serious. "I know I've got a lot of work to do on myself, but I want to do more. I want to be a part of what you're building. I've seen how much it's changed my life, and I want to help the next generation." Jack smiled at him, a deep sense of pride filling him. "I knew you'd get there, Darnell. You're already making a difference. Just keep doing what you're doing, man. You've got the heart and the strength to help a lot of people." Jack leaned back in his chair later that day, his mind racing with the realization that the legacy was already underway. It wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about one person's redemption. It was about a whole community, a network of mentors, students, and parents working together to build something lasting. As the phone buzzed with another message from Emily, Jack took a moment to reflect on everything he had been through. It had been a long, hard road, but it had been worth every step. The legacy was no longer a dream. It was real, and it was only just beginning. A year had passed since Jack stood before the group of teachers, outlining his vision for pathways to change. It had been a whirlwind year, full of challenges and triumphs, but one thing was certain: the work was only just beginning. The program had now expanded into several schools, and with each new partnership, Jack saw the ripples of change growing. The future had never felt so alive with possibility. But even as things grew, Jack knew the true measure of success wasn't in numbers or accolades. It was in the lives that had been changed. It was in the stories of kids like Tyler and Darnell, who had once been lost, angry, and disconnected, but were now standing tall as mentors themselves. It was in the quiet progress of kids like Emma, who had once been shy and unsure, but now carried herself with a quiet confidence. Jack had become something he never thought possible: a leader, not just in name, but in spirit. And it wasn't just about the kids anymore. It was about the community, the entire ecosystem of change that had begun to unfold. That morning, Jack stood on the steps of a local high school, looking out at a crowd of parents, teachers, community leaders, and students who had gathered to celebrate the success of Pathways to Change. It was the culmination of a year's worth of work, the first annual community summit, an event that showcased the positive impact the program had made, from academic improvements to personal transformations. Jack was nervous, though he had grown accustomed to public speaking. It wasn't about the speech. It was about what this moment represented. This wasn't just a celebration of a program. It was a celebration of change, of growth, of second chances. He stepped to the microphone, feeling the weight of every eye on him. But he wasn't intimidated. This moment wasn't about him. It was about the kids, the community, the people who had walked this journey with him. He cleared his throat, looking out at the crowd. "When I first started this journey, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if anyone would even listen. I was just a guy trying to make sense of my own life, trying to find redemption. But what I've learned over the past few years is that redemption isn't just about one person. It's about all of us together." Jack paused, his voice steady but emotional. "I'm not here to take credit for what's happened. The credit belongs to the kids who show up every day, the families who support them, the teachers and mentors who believe in them. I'm here because of all of you. This isn't just my journey, it's our journey. And together, we've built something that can last." A slow wave of applause started, growing louder as Jack spoke. "I've seen kids transform, not just in their grades or behavior, but in their hearts. I've seen them find hope, find their voice, and find a new direction. And I know that none of this would have been possible without all of you here today. This isn't just a program, it's a movement, and it's only going to grow." The applause grew, but Jack raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "I don't know what the future holds," he continued, his voice firm, "but I know that no matter what, we're going to keep moving forward. The future is right in front of us, and I'm excited to see where we'll go next." Later that day, as the event wound down, Jack took a moment to himself. He stepped outside the school, the cool air refreshing after the excitement of the morning. He looked up at the sky, a sense of peace settling over him. The road had been long, and at times it had felt impossible. But now, Standing on the edge of something even bigger, Jack knew that he had found his purpose. He thought of Tyler, now a full-time mentor in the program, working with younger kids who needed guidance. He thought of Darnell, who had not only turned his life around but had also taken on the role of a community outreach coordinator, spreading the message of hope and change. He thought of Emma, who had recently started high school, confident and eager to make the most of her future. This wasn't just a story of Jack anymore. It was a story of so many others. Each person had found their own path, their own way to contribute. And together, they were changing lives, one step at a time. A few days later, Jack sat down for a quiet dinner with Emily at their favorite local restaurant. They had both been so busy with the program's expansion that they hadn't had a chance to really talk, just the two of them. "How's it feel?" Emily asked, leaning back in her chair and studying him. Jack smiled, looking out the window for a moment before meeting her gaze. "It feels real. The program, the community, it's growing, Emily. It's happening." Emily reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You did it, Jack. You really did it." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't do it alone. We all did it. But yeah, it's been incredible. It's not just about turning things around. It's about building something that can stand the test of time." The waitress came by with their check, and they shared a quiet moment before leaving. As they walked out of the restaurant, Jack felt the weight of the moment, an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything that had happened. He had been through hell and back, but in the end, it was all worth it. He had built something that would last long after he was gone, a legacy of change, redemption, and hope. That night, Jack stood outside his apartment, looking out over the city. It had been a long day, but a fulfilling one. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He had done it. They had all done it. The road ahead was still full of challenges, but Jack knew that with the community he had helped build, his family, his friends, his students, they could face anything. The future was waiting, and they were ready.